Welcome everyone to track one. I'm going to be your track share today, and I am going to be kind of walking you through stuff. So workshop number one is going to be by Doctors Kevin Dong, Joana Dida, Spencer Sample, Brendon Trotter, and myself. And we're going to be talking about giving a mini podcast workshop, and I will be recording this session. So as it says here in all the icons, this session will be recorded. We'd like to you to turn on your camera at some point for some higher interactivity. If you want to make sure you're muted, I can also mute you if you forget, because I'm the host of this session. If you want to ask questions in advance of the end, then definitely put it in the chat box, and we'll definitely make sure that we have that. This workshop will be using some breakout groups at the end, maybe if you wanted to ask specific questions of certain speakers, but we'll probably mainly be didactic, and we will be we'll be asking you to stay on the Zoom as a sign of respect and try not to jump around too much after the 5-minute mark. And after the session is done, we'd like you to rate the speakers. In terms of conflicts of interest, the team will go through that, but generally speaking, most of them don't have any big conflicts of interest. In fact, they probably just lose money based on the podcast. So definitely something that we can share with you a little bit as we go forward. All right, so I'm going to be I'm going to be recording. We are going to be recording the session now. So, all right. So I'm going to exit now, stop share, and Dr. Dong is going to take over from here.
All right. Let me just share my screen here. Awesome. Can everyone see that? All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. So thanks, Teresa, for being the track chair and also a member of this talk. So you're the multi-face of this. This is amazing. So thanks for joining our workshop, everybody. Today, the initial part is going to be a bit didactic, but there's an interactive aspect as well. But feel free to ask questions on the chat box, and we'll also have opportunities for people to speak as well, actually speaking to their Zoom, because we want this to be also a bit of an interactive multimedia session. So thanks again for joining. I'll be starting first, but this will be a talk, a collaboration with all of the MacEmerg podcast members, Dr. Spencer Sample, Joana Dida, Brendon Trotter, and Teresa Chan, and myself, Kevin Dong. So our workshop is on podcasts, and we're really excited to present our work for the last 2 years or so on this amazing project that we've been working on. And so hope you enjoy it as well. All right. So no disclosure conflict interest. Like Teresa said, we're in fact probably losing money. So if you're in it for the money, this is not the place to be. That's for sure. In terms of the objectives, we're going to introduce the podcast itself and our project, or MacEmerg podcast, as an introduction and how we've kind of evolved. And then Joanna's going to talk a little bit about how do you start your own podcast and your thoughts and designs. And then Spencer and Brendon are going to tag team the software, hardware, equipment, as well as the recording and editing. And then we're going to have a little bit of demo of the podcast and editing aspect as well, so you can kind of see how we do things. And Spencer's going to show us how to do that. And then Teresa's going to finish off strong with some work on publishing and how do you publish your podcast. So before we start, let's listen to kind of the beginning of our podcast. So hopefully people here have listened to it. Can some people on the chat box say if you've actually listened to our podcast before? Has anyone listened before in the past? Awesome. Yay. I'm happy that I have a few people who said yes. That's great. If not, please check us out. We post monthly episodes first day of every month, and we'll talk a little bit about it and why you should listen to it. But that's amazing. Thank you, guys. So here's the kind of our intro.
Welcome to the MacEmerg podcast. My name is Teresa Chan, and with me I have
Kevin Dong, Brendon Trotter, and Joana Dida.
And we'll be your podcast team.
Our goal is to connect all the MacMaster-affiliated emergency physicians so we all get to know each other a little better.
We have so much great talent and expertise in this region. We want to highlight it into one regional podcast.
Each podcast features one invited guest to speak about their expertise or interests.
Additionally, we will feature external speakers who have delivered regional rounds at one of our teaching sites.
And don't forget about the residents.
We'll be featuring stories about our residents and what they've been up to as well. All right, are you ready? Let's get started with this month's episode.
So that's kind of the starting of our podcast. And every podcast starts like that as well. So I'm really hoping that we have some new listeners today, and we'll continue to work on our craft as well as we keep going on with this project. So to introduce our project, essentially the reason why we started was that we wanted to create a communication tool where we were able to share information as well as disseminate knowledge amongst all of the MacMaster affiliated emergency medicine sites across the Golden Horseshoe. That includes places like Kitchener-Waterloo, Niagara, Oakville, and actually places in Toronto as well that are affiliated to MacMaster, as well as the core sites in Hamilton. We wanted to create a way to connect and share some of the strong local expertise on topics such as medical education, clinical pearls, research accomplishments and findings, as well as a way to promote local accomplishments, and then also talk about wellness, and also add a lot of resident expertise as well as their accomplishments as well. So that was the initial goal, to start this podcast in a local and regional aspect, and that's how we got started in 2018. So this is a little bit of a timeline of how we came to be. We created like an Avengers-like team initially with the members that you see before. We actually attended, I don't know if you guys know Anton Hellman, but he's an awesome podcaster for emergency medicine. But he actually has a podcast weekend camp that we all attended and learned kind of the initial basics of how to create a podcast. And then we kind of started working on our craft. So we started recording contents, met on a regular basis, designed the structure of our podcast, and then created a schedule. We edited, and we worked on publishing, and Teresa was awesome on working on that as well. And then we essentially started to add medical school members and really grew our team to now, I think we have about 8 or 9 members, which is amazing. And we have a website, we have an Apple iTunes, we publish on SoundCloud, so please check us out. But we've really done a lot of good work. And then now we've kind of started to move on to more of the research and scholarship aspects as well. And we just recently sent in a paper for that first aspect. So our segments for our podcast include a staff segment, which deal with those topics I described before. We have a resident physician segment as well called Resident Corner, which is headed by our very own Joana Dida, who will be speaking in the next section. We have a medical education aspect that is hosted by Teresa, as well as Dr. Aline Nagyi, who is a prominent figure in our ranks at MacEmerg. And we also have announcements aspect as well, especially things like if we have a faculty development, we'll have a little announcement about that so people can join and talk and listen to our local experts. And we range topics from anywhere from clinical as well as medical education, wellness. We talk even things about technology and medical education, social media, and et cetera. So when we describe the scholarship that we've been working on, the first thing that we did was actually looked at actually kind of our impact locally and how many people are listening to in our local area. So because that is our primary goal. And right now, as of now, we have a total of 18 episodes. And in each episode, we have about 227.7 listens with a plus minus of 67. Some listens actually total up to 400, some less, a little bit less. And we've determined that from our analytical data that we have about 40% originating from the MacEmerg affiliate sites, which is pretty good considering that is our local, that is our actual regional goal. And that actually doesn't include Toronto because we have a lot of MacEmerg affiliated people that work in Toronto, but we couldn't include it because we didn't want, there was a lot of crossover between people that don't work on Mac but are from Toronto. So that number we expect actually to be much higher. So our future plan actually is to now do more of a quantitative feedback of our podcast, make improvements, and then ultimately our goal is to create a primer so that other institutions can create local podcasting that highlight some of the objectives that we have as well for our podcast. So I'm done with mine. I really hope that you guys listen to our podcast, but this is Joanna's session. So go ahead, Joe.
So how do you start your own podcast? Let's say you're interested in a topic. How do you go about it? And what are the planning steps that are involved in it? Before we get started on some of the more what I consider design questions on how you start your own podcast, I first want to pose a question to the general audience here. If we can just go on to the next slide, Kevin. Perfect. Kevin, perfect. So I want to pose this question to you. What is your passion? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say you will have an opportunity to talk about in a podcast about something that you're passionate about? If I could just invite everyone to type into the chat box. There's no such thing as embarrassing answers. There's no such thing as, too awkward or can't do it. Just anything. Could be academic.
Health equity. That's a good one. Health equity. Earlier palliative care. Yeah,
that's awesome.
Great. Medical technology and universal health care. Yeah. Graduate medical education or postgraduate medical education in Canada.
I love that this is all around faculty development. Yeah. We can also go a little wild here and go, outside, think outside of the box. If there's anything outside of medicine, more than happy to.
Women's advocacy, global health, joy in primary care, animals, interesting animals. I love that one. Burnout, coffee. Yep, exclamation mark. Women in medicine.
Maybe tigers. Has anyone seen that in the new Netflix show that everyone is talking about?
Let's see.
Scotch.
Oh, nice.
God, yes. I will rank quite a few of,
leading some kind of patient caregiver revolution. That sounds very exciting. Single malt, though, only apparently one person wants. Stress mindfulness, stress management and mindfulness training. Yep. Travel destinations. That's exciting. Design and branding. Yep. Those are really cool.
It sounds like all of us need to hang out after this conference is done, and we can talk about how to start your own podcast, because these are all fantastic ideas, and all of them, require more podcasts out there, because I don't know many that talk about single malt Scotch, to be perfectly honest. I haven't heard of any yet, at least. Maybe I should start looking. Perfect. So it's nice to see that people, as you can tell, are passionate about different topics. But how do you go about taking that passion and turning it into a podcast? And that's what we wanted to address with our little workshop today. So how did we go about it? Well, when it comes to designing any kind of project for that matter, not just a podcast, these are the 6 W's questions whose answers are considered fairly basic in information gathering or problem solving. So one of the things that we wanted to answer when we first started off, before we even started recording these podcasts or these episodes, was what was the objective of our podcast, of the MacEmerg podcast? What are you trying to convey? We all know that there's many podcasts out there. There's certainly an abundance of them. But what was the objective specifically for us? And as Kevin alluded to earlier, for us specifically, the MacEmerg group, it was about helping with information gathering and dissemination amongst all of the MacEmerg ER-affiliated sites. The next question that kind of falls within that same category is, what is the style of your podcast? We've all heard different podcasts out there. Is it narrative style? Is it a one-man style? Is it interview style? Is it scripted, not scripted? So these are all questions that you had to answer beforehand just to make sure that you had a good plan going forward. When it comes to the second question that you see there, who's your audience? Well, again, there's plenty of podcasts out there. Are you targeting this towards clerks? Are you targeting this towards lay public? Are you targeting this towards staff emergency physician? For us particularly, it was all the emergency-related allied healthcare providers and staff, whether that's staff physicians, trainees in emergency medicine, nurses, and other allied healthcare workers in the emergency sites, certainly locally, but also regionally. And then the next question that I think is extremely, extremely important, and probably one of the most important ones, is why is your podcast unique? Again, as alluded to earlier, there's certainly an abundance of podcasts out there. There's never a shortage of them, it feels like these days, certainly in the era of COVID pandemic. But what makes it, why should our listeners listen to our podcast? In emergency medicine specifically, we know that there is many podcasts out there, including but not limited to things like EM Cases and Clerkcast and MRAP and whatnot. And a lot of them answer really good questions, which is things like, how do you best manage a COPD exacerbation in the emergency room? what is the risk of an embolic event after, let's say, defibrillation for atrial fibrillation. But some of the things that we noticed that were, some of the questions rather that were not being answered were things like, what about resources what resources rather are there available to address intimate partner violence when a patient presents in the emergency department? Or what are some key things you want to review with parents before you discharge a pediatric patient from your local emergency site? And this is where we thought we were unique, and this is the niche that we wanted to fill in. And why should our listeners listen to our MacEmerg podcast? Well, specifically, as mentioned, is that we thought this was a novel communication way to deliver different types of topics, whether that was medical education, clinical pearls, research accomplishments, wellness, and other topics. And then some of the other questions are a little bit more about planning, the specifics and the details. So when will you release your podcast? And as Kevin alluded to, ours is released at the first of every month. And this is important to have a schedule going forward because your listener, it's key to keeping your audience engaged. However, sometimes this comes with being flexible to adapting to a changing environment. Although for our group, we release it at the beginning of every month, the first of every month. For example, with a rapidly changing COVID pandemic environment, we had to adapt, and we released some special episodes that provided up-to-date and time-sensitive information regarding the COVID pandemic. We still kept our regular scheduled episodes, but we wanted to adapt as well to the changing environment. So it's key to have that schedule going forward, but while they're still being flexible. And then the last question maybe is that it's a part of these top 6 W questions is where will you release your podcast? And so for us, it was a lot about online platforms, and I will leave that to Teresa Chan later on to talk about the publishing piece of it. And so if we move on to the next slide, these are some of the 6 basic key questions that we talked about. And within those 6 key questions, when you answer them, you're getting at the answer to these key elements, or what we consider the basics when it comes to having a successful podcast team and project. The most important thing I would say would probably be the team. You want enthusiastic, you want passionate people. You don't want people that are talking just about, they're just another to-do thing on their list. You want people to talk about what they're passionate about and actually be motivated to do the work. More importantly, just like similar to a hockey team, you can't score very much. All you have is defensemen. You also need to have the right people in the team. So for our team, it was important to have key stakeholders that were interested and experienced or not experienced, but willing to learn into different areas of podcasting, whether that was, people who were wanting to do interviewing, whether it was editing, promoting, publishing, etc., etc. So it's important to have those key stakeholders within your team. The next sort of basic idea that again falls within those 6 W questions that we talked about in the previous slide was just the idea itself. For us, it started with us wishing to connect all of the local emergency medicine ER sites, and then the rest is history, as they say, 18 months later now. And then the last piece is around scheduling and planning, which we talked a little bit about earlier. And it's not only about planning when will you release it, how frequent or when will you release your podcasts, episodes or segments, but also planning around your team. We all know that in academic medicine, the commitment to certain projects will change with time as team members will take on different roles. And as such, you just have to be adaptable to that. You have to plan for a legacy team, plan who's going to take over afterwards. Or if one team member is not going to be able to contribute as much in the next year because of other team commitment or project commitments, then you need to plan for that ahead. Some of the other basic steps in planning involved talking about the length of the episodes and trying to stay consistent, as well as the publishing piece that we talked about already. So, who's ready to start a podcast? I'll hand it over to maybe Spencer and Brendon to take us through software and hardware equipment.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about the equipment needed for starting and kind of implementing your podcast. So Kevin, if you go to the next slide. So there's a couple of different types of softwares that we use. The digital audio workstation is kind of the main centerpiece of the software. We use Hindenburg. And this is where we put all of our files together. We edit the files, take out the things that we want to remove, add our music, that kind of thing. and then we'll export this and use an audio production software to kind of do the final processing. And we use Ophonic. You can see the title down in the left there, which allows us to do auto leveling of the sound and noise reduction. So this is something that helps to minimize the variation in sound, so you're not 1 second having trouble hearing someone talking and then having the next person yelling in your ear, kind of thing. Some other digital audio workstations that you could use that are free would be GarageBand if you have a Mac, or Audacity is something that is pretty good as well, which can be on PC and Macs. So the next thing that we use is a distance recording software. So we use Zencastr. You can see the name there, kind of in the middle at the bottom. That allows us to do recordings at a distance, which is especially relevant during this pandemic. But even if it's not a pandemic and you just can't make time to meet in person, you can use this method to record at a distance. And then something else that we use that I didn't mention on here is Dropbox, which we kind of use for our data management. So we all have Dropbox, which lets us upload files, edit files with everything kind of being up to date. And that's a very important way to manage the data. And then the last thing we have is the publishing software. So Teresa will talk about this later, but there's a couple of different options that you can use for actually disseminating the podcast out to the public. So the next slide, yeah, Brendon.
Okay, guys, so for hardware, the good news is you can use a fairly wide variety of stuff. The price of entry is actually fairly minimal, especially if you just want to start with a smartphone. The internal mic on at least the newest iPhones is pretty good. I know Teresa actually uses hers quite a bit. I think she hides in the closet with a sheet over her head to kind of minimize sound, but as long as you get some practice with kind of speaking directly and clearly into the mic, as a single interviewee kind of situation, that works reasonably well.
Yeah, I haven't done any randomized controlled trials, but I've sent some blinded taste tests to some frequent podcasters, and they were surprised at how good the iPhone 10 was. Not that I have product endorsement of that either. No conflicts of interest. Like I said, we've only lost money on this initiative. So.
Yeah, so if you're just starting out, at least an up-to-date iPhone anyway, relatively up-to-date with just the recorder program is reasonably good to at least capture the data. I wouldn't suggest trying to edit anything on the iPhone, but just to capture the MP3 files is reasonably good. If you're looking to travel around, obviously this is going to be kind of post-COVID times, because most of the time, recently anyway, we've been doing interviews remotely through things like Zencastr. But if you're going to be traveling around and you expect to need a couple different mics, especially, so if you're interviewing somebody in person, often it'll be good to have a couple different microphones. The price of a couple of these, Tascam and Zoom are a couple of the more commonly and well-reviewed brands that I think probably around $250 for these portable digital recorders. So they're multi-track, so they come with built-in microphones, which you can see on the top. So you can just put it down on a table and speak, as long as you get a bit of practice knowing like what distance you need to be from the built-in microphones. Or on the bottom of each of these, there are connectors for external microphones, so you can plug in two into each of these kind of fairly entry-level recorders. And so the interviewer and the interviewee can each have their own microphone. Next one there, Kev. So in terms of choosing mics, so if you do decide to put a bit of money into this and you're going to be wanting a couple different mics for yourself and whoever you're interviewing, you do need to know a bit about how microphones work in terms of pickup patterns. And so we won't go into that now, but just be aware that kind of just buying a mic without looking into how they work and what they're good for would probably be ill-advised. Some are very directional, and so it would be good just to speak directly into. Some are a bit better for picking up background sound, and might be good for interviewing a couple people or multiple people at once if you find the position is quite good. And so just be aware of the connections involved. So there's kind of the XLR fat kind of professional cables. I don't know, you may or may not know what that means, but if you look down in that audio interface box there at the bottom, that blue box, those connections on the left are XLR connections, like professional audio connections essentially. Some will have kind of a mini jack, so if you're using something like just a iPhone headphone with a little mic on it, sometimes might actually work pretty well. And then some will have USB. And so the reason why these are all different is that when you have sound that comes into a microphone, it needs to be converted from a analog source to a digital signal. So it's called a DAC, a digital analog converter. And that's when you get digital output through a USB connection. If you're looking for a standalone mic, the two ones that I have posted there are about $150. The one on the left is called the Blue Yeti. And so that one has a selector where you can actually use a bunch of different patterns, and microphone patterns. So it can be very directional, so it's good for just one person, or it can be set to a setting where it can be fairly good for groups of people, and it's a USB connection. So that one, all you need to do is bring that and a laptop, something to plug it into to record sound. The one on the right is a fairly directional, well-reviewed podcasting microphone, but it's good for kind of just one person. You'd have to pass it back and forth if you wanted to interview someone else, just be aware of that. If you're using these professional XLR connection microphones like the one on the right, just be aware that you do need a way to plug it into your computer, something that converts the analog signal to a digital signal. So that's when you're looking at something called an audio interface. And those are built into laptops. They're tiny little microchips, and that's how you plug in your little headphone and microphone into the 1/8" jack. But for these higher end external microphones, you do need something to connect it to the computer. So depending on what you want to do, if you want to walk around with a laptop and a audio interface, I think Kevin does that. Or if you want to get that Yeti microphone on the left, you can just plug it directly into your laptop. So a bunch of different considerations to think about when you're thinking about purchasing equipment. But all told, you can do this for very little money. Next slide there, Kev. So in terms of additional equipment, you do want to stand. If you're using external microphones, you do want to stand. The one on the left is something that has a little bit of a shock isolation. So if it's sitting on tables and things and people are knocking them, it helps to isolate the sound a bit. And that little circular thing in front is called a pop filter. So this helps kind of filter out things called plosives. So if someone is speaking with a lot of P's, like those kind of sounds where you kind of close off the opening of your mouth and then make the consonant sound, it can make these fairly obnoxious, I guess, sounds on the recorder because it's very large pressure changes in sound. And so that helps kind of minimize that. And then you just need to know you have all the cables that are important for the equipment you have. Next slide there. So just a few tips about recording. Next slide there. And then after we talk briefly about that, Spencer's going to go through our little very brief kind of editing demonstration. Obviously, there's a lot to cover there, so just kind of a general flow of how we do things. So from a recording standpoint, the most important thing is to prep. So prep yourself and prep the people you're interviewing. And as Joanna was mentioning, I mean, there's kind of a wide range of ways in which you can do this. But at the very least, you want to come up with topics that you're going to actually discuss. Probably, almost for sure, you want to come up with kind of prearranged questions and at least have the interviewee have some time to formulate answers before you actually do any kind of recording. And this can go all the way up to fully scripted interviews. Some of like Anton, I think, does mostly fully scripted interviews. That it does take a little bit of practice to make them sound natural. It's not just reading off of a script. We kind of do something in the middle, I suppose, for the most part. You need to know, especially in the era of remote recording, although even after COVID, we're going to do a lot of this, is that the person on the other end knows how to use their equipment, the software Zencaster, for example, and has an appropriate microphone and knows how to use it. Let them know what to expect, just in the general kind of thought patterns in speaking, what to avoid in terms of sounds, various things, some of which are very easy to edit out, some are not. And you kind of get a hang of that if you start editing your own podcast to know what's important to control up front and what is not a big deal. So second, location is everything. Just make sure the area is quiet, no interruptions. There's a lot of background noise sources, such as ventilation is a common one. People walking by in the hallway or opening the door. So just be aware of those things. Be aware of squeaky chairs, knocking the tables. Knocking the tables is actually a big one. Is moving forward, especially if the microphone is on the table, it's really hard to edit those kind of things out after the fact because it introduces sounds in the middle of someone speaking. So it's not like an or an that you can easily edit it out. So when recording, just remember that how you're doing it will depend on what equipment you have. So single microphone or multiple mics, and just make sure you have the equipment for that. For kind of external microphones, you want to sit quite close to the microphone. have a pop filter if possible. And if you're using an iPhone, especially if you're starting out, just make sure that notifications are off. Probably just put it in airplane mode altogether. It's the easiest thing to do. And think of your editor. So the hardest thing to edit is when the interview is a little bit meandering and you kind of go through a topic and then go to something else and then come back. And it's really hard to put together a coherent thought when it's kind of all over the place in an interview. So just be aware of that. So probably the most important point is to make sure your interviewee is aware that you may ask them to kind of restart a thought and to summarize more clearly, and just have them prepared for that. It's not that what they're saying is not well organized, but just could be said better in a coherent way that makes it easier for editing. Next slide there.
Yeah, so I'm going to give some tips for editing, and then we'll show a little demonstration afterwards. But basically, for me, a lot of my job has been editing. So it's been important. It's been very important for me to be familiar with the software that I use. It lets you kind of listen to a clip and know what you can do with it before you actually start editing it. And it also lets you get faster if you get to learn more of what the capabilities of the software are. So I think it's valuable to find a good one. Like the one we use is quite good. It's called Hindenburg. Everyone might remember the first time I used it, I sent a message to our WhatsApp group saying I fell in love with Hindenburg. So it's good to, yeah. So it's good to find one and kind of stick to it so that you can know it very well. And the second point here is kind of part of that, learning short keys. So you'll see when we're doing the demonstration, I'll use all the clicking of buttons just so I can kind of show you a little bit more, but it becomes very quick to do things when you can just press buttons on your keyboard to do certain functions that you do frequently. So that's a good thing as well. And then kind of what Brendon was talking about, coaching before you record. Some things particularly for me would be, it's always good to, if someone makes a mistake, have them stop and leave a pause so that the editor knows, like, this is the restarting of that kind of, for instance. And another thing, kind of like Brendon mentioned, one of the really hard things is you have super enthusiastic people who are banging their hands on the table right in the middle of a sentence, and that really it gets in your way when you're editing. So those are kind of the big things that I would mention. And something that Teresa likes to talk about is having people, if they go through something once and there's a lot of ums and ahs, they might be able to cut some of those things out if they do it again, and kind of give it a second go over. So that's another good tip. So the other thing is,
I was just going to add one more thing, is that rolly chairs. Rolly chairs are like the editor and the interviewer's worst enemy.
No.
So if you can avoid rolly chairs at all costs, it's really hard to make them stationary, and they end up squeaking and doing all this other stuff. Yeah. So a regular chair that has 4 legs, no wheels, and can't lean backwards is the best friend. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the last thing here, I think, is more kind of variable for who's editing. Personally, I like to remove lots of ums and ahs, but you kind of have to figure out what works for you and what works for your podcast. If you remove too many ums and ahs, it can sound very edited. So sometimes you have to leave some of them in. Same thing with filling in voids. Sometimes you can add sounds in to fill in voids if that's kind of your preference. And then one of the hard parts is playing around with the noise. So in a couple of ways. So especially in a podcast where we have different segments, you have to get good at matching the volume of the different segments, because one might be quieter than the other, and if once you transition between them, the person's like headphones might start blasting into their ears. So you got to be very conscious of that. And the other thing is that sitting in your quiet room is very different than sitting in your car on the highway. So we have to kind of give a certain range of the volume for different types of listeners. So that's also something to consider. I think some of us actually, I've done this before, edit a podcast, then listen to it in the car when I'm driving to work or something, just to make sure that it can be listened to in the car.
Yeah, and one pro tip is that if you are doing a medical podcast, just do think about the use of sirens is something that's very alluring to many people to use, but it is the worst idea because most people actually listen to their podcasts in the car. And so the sirens can be very disconcerting to people as they're listening. So just be mindful of that.
Yeah. So maybe Kevin, you could give me the helm here.
Yeah.
Sorry, one more second before you guys. I had actually meant to throw it back to the people that do most of the recording for any tips. So Kevin, Teresa, and Joanna, anything we didn't mention that you want to impart upon our audience here for tips for recording?
Yeah. Kevin, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, so what I wanted to do is just summarize what all that was that if you really want to create the most simple skeleton of creating a podcast, you just need something to record with. So say your phone, which is free, record someone that you picked, then you take that audio file that you recorded. You can either publish that right directly if you feel like you have 100% amazing, clear audio, but normally most people will require some editing of that because they're going to be able to make a lot of mistakes. So you take that audio file, put it in a recording software like Hindenburg that we discussed, but there's free ones as well. And then you edit that, and then you use a publishing service like SoundCloud or whatnot, and then you put that out there. So that's your kind of basic skeleton of how a podcast works for people that are very basic in podcast knowledge. There's a lot of nuances. But
to be completely honest, Kevin, the other thing would be if you're just looking to do something local for your learners or for your group, you could host the MP4 or MP3 on Dropbox and send people the link. You could host it on Google Drive just at the very beginning if you don't want this to be disseminated across all the platforms. You only need to get to that level when you want to make it open to the public, right? But if you're looking to use this to spruce up your curriculum, let's say you're a nursing clinical instructor and you just have a series of audio files you want your students to come armed with when they show up to the first clinical exposure, you know what? A Dropbox link with all the files in it is totally fine. So definitely you don't have to feel too intimidated by all the different things. So that was one of my tips as well. Joe?
And then when it comes to interviewing specifically, like you don't have to feel like you have to be experienced at interviewing people. One of the tricks that I used very early on was that if you, let's say you're talking about a topic that you yourself are not super comfortable with or knowledgeable in beyond your little research you've done beforehand, or the person you're interviewing tends to be more junior, not experienced with public speaking, or nervous about speaking or being recorded, then you can do a little bit more of the prep than you would otherwise. So I tend to script more than not, and that tends to be because I interview more junior speakers and more sometimes nervous public speakers. And so it tends to be useful to just have that prep 2 weeks in advance. I send a bunch of questions maybe or general guidelines, and depending on their comfort level, they can write out answers and then work about how to interview with pauses and to make it more conversational. But at least they'll have something to refer to if they get nervous or if they feel like they're uncomfortable just speaking on the spot. And versus other people like Teresa Chan might interview rather more on the spot and a lot more conversational because of the types of people that she gets to interview. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think that like as your craft evolves, you'll be more comfortable yourself. So I have kind of a canned speech that I give to everyone at the beginning. Like I'm like, so Joanna, I'm going to be interviewing you. I want you to feel like we're just having a conversation. I'll do all this stuff to like make them forget that I'm even recording. And basically we'll go through and even just have a 1, 2, 3 that kind of goes through what topics we're going to cover. I might even send them an email that has that so they know their talking points. And so it's similar to a script, just like cue cards basically, and then evolve from there. I do sometimes coach my speakers, as it was alluded to. I might say, Kevin, that was great. You said some really great points. Can you just say it from this point one more time? And so I'm constantly taking notes on the side. Just if there's a great turn of phrase, I might ask someone to say it one more time, and that usually turns out better. So if you ask me to say that one more time, I'll say it better. And I don't have the and I don't have the and there's some working memory that can be used to advantage there. So definitely, I think that's awesome. But I think it's time for Spencer to do his demo. He's raring to go. So maybe Kevin, can you stop your screen share and then he can take over?
Stop share.
Okay, so someone will have to tell me if it's too loud.
Yeah, Spencer, you have to start your screen share now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So this everyone can see it, okay?
Yeah.
So this is what Hindenburg looks like. Basically, there's the 3 tracks here, and you can import your files into them, and it will look like this. So here I have the interviewer, just Kevin, and in this case, the speaker is Teresa. And then I'll have all the kind of audio music connector things in this top track here. So I'll just give you a little listen.
And as you can see, as he scrolls and he wants to make the timeline longer, all the pieces are dilating out.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening into
so there
our...
you can hear kind of, there was like the pre-podcast, like, oh, how are you doing type thing right
All right,
here.
we're just recording. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm going to look
Perfect.
at find
Okay,
where the podcast starts.
Thanks again, everyone, for...
So we'll say it starts here. And then I'm using my mouse here so you can see everything, but normally I would do this a little bit better. So I'm going to split the tracks, remove kind of the beginning parts, and then I can bring my audio in. And now obviously there's an overlap, so I'll have to kind of drag everything to line it up. And this will move everything past it as well. So now we'll have our music.
About their expertise or interests.
Featuring stories about our residents and what they've been up to as well. All right, are you ready? Let's get started with this month's episode.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening
so there
into
you get your kind of transition there. So we'll listen to this. I know there's an somewhere in here that I can edit out.
Our MacEmerg podcast today.
I've learned exactly
is
what
our
they look like.
June episode. Wow,
so I already know it's right here.
It's June already, and I guess we're already in the thick and things of COVID-19, unfortunately. But we're all hanging in there, the MacEmerg crew, and we're going to try our best to get you the post as well. Very, very important, at least to me and her, and as well as many of our listeners, hopefully on MacEmerg, and it's that social media.
So let's say I wanted to remove this. I will line up here. I'm going to press I on my keyboard, which kind of marks coming into it, and then going here, I'm going to press out, so that kind of selects that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to click on both of my tracks so that this section gets removed from both. Press cut, and now that's out. And when we listen again,
it's that social media in medical education as well as clinical education.
Got that space without that there.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so you kind of just go through the whole thing, add in your music and stuff between your segments, and that's kind of the basics of it.
The most satisfying things is when you can identify the ums by just looking in the track from far away.
Oh yeah, that's my jam now.
And you're like, bam, I can cut this off. Bam, I can cut this off without even listening sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can
look different too.
I'm happy to stay around a little bit afterwards. If anyone has specific questions, I can go through a little bit more with that.
All right. So Spencer, that's awesome. So I'm going to take it from here. And Kevin, thank you for driving the slides. So now it's about how to get it out there. And so you've cut your audio, you're ready, you have this MP3 or MP4 file, and you're like, how do I get to the rest of the world? Kevin, next slide. And so there were some questions earlier, and I will cover those, but I think there are kind of 3 main steps to consider. So number 1 would be the idea of podcast hosting. So just like a website needs a place where it lives, you need to have a hosting service where your podcast and all the data associated with the podcast can be hosted. And this often does actually require some level of funding. And so that's why I joked earlier about not having a conflict of interest, because all we do is lose money, is that we actually have spotted the podcast some in terms of getting it started, right? And so the idea would be that we had hosted on SoundCloud for a certain period of time where it was free, and then since then we've had to subscribe to the SoundCloud hosting service so that we can continue to post new podcasts. And so if you're just trying it out, or you have a really short course, you could set up a SoundCloud account just to try it out. There's also a bigger company called Libsyn, when we listed it there, that is kind of probably the industry standard right now for a lot of podcast service. What's nice about both of these services is that they do a lot of the pushing out there to a lot of the podcast apps. So if there are podcast apps out there that you like, iHeartRadio or other SoundCloud has its own app, but there are different apps that people use, and they will push it out there. The only two services that require separate registration, it's kind of like in PubMed, you need to have indexing, and so iTunes and I guess it's called Apple Podcast now has its own registration system. So they're kind of snobby, kind of like PubMed, and you can't get in by itself. You have to adhere to all their standards, and once you're indexed on there, that's pretty awesome. And Apple Play, Google Play, Apple has the podcast, and then Google has their Play service as well, and Google Play requires a secondary application as well. So it's kind of funny. It's kind of like with journals, you have to worry about whether or not you're indexed on all the different sites, and with podcasts, you have to think about the same thing. So that's kind of an interesting analogy. And what do you use to disseminate? Well, SoundCloud and Libsyn, like I said, push to many apps. Apple Podcasts and Google Play have their separate applications. But what's nice is that once you make it into those registries, as soon as you release an episode, literally I get a notification the moment I upload my file and it's ready for the world and I make it public, my phone notifies me that I have a new podcast to listen to. And so that's pretty awesome. And you can do that right from your phone, actually. But I usually like to add our logo and our jingle and the outro and stuff like that to make sure that everything's professionally done. So our podcast team often does the extreme makeover of our podcast before we release it. And then to get it out there, what we do is we can actually link the SoundCloud link and embed it within our website. So if you Google MacEmerg CPD, and we can throw the link up on the Slack or in the chat box. Actually, if Spencer can link us, throw that link up, or Kevin, you'll be able to see how we do it. We have it embedded right into the website, and so people can actually play the audio from the website itself. So for a lot of our faculty who are not super tech savvy and don't know that they have the podcast app on their phone, this is the way they're listening to it. And that's pretty awesome because it doesn't require any additional tech savviness other than you get emailed the link and then you can click on it. So especially if you're like creating a website, let's say for your clinical rotation, or you have a new class where you have a different curricula that you want to disseminate through there, you could just start a little Google site and embed the links all in there, and people can play them in order. And then we push it out to the world by using Twitter. I guess you could use Instagram. Some people had asked about that as well. But I find that Instagram, it's hard to link to things. One of the things we do have is we do have a MacEmerg Instagram, and what we have is some med students who make a infographic and all that stuff. So that's something that we put through to the Instagram crowd to let them know that we have a new podcast episode, and then they can go to the website. And email's an oldie but goodie. And so definitely spread the word through email or your WhatsApp group to your faculty members or your learners. That's a great way to disseminate, especially for a local podcast like ours. So if you're not looking to reach the entire world, but rather to just raise awareness of cool things, like if you're, let's say, a division director, or you're assistant dean like me, and you want to leave to a small group of faculty and you just want to send them an audio file to change things up instead of an email, definitely that's the way to go. You can just email them the link and they can click, right? So definitely some cool things that you can do. I know that some people use YouTube as their sound cloud equivalent, and that's a great way to get to a broader audience as well. It's findable. What I would suggest there is that if you have your audio files, you can just put a photo basically in the video editing software, so Adobe Premiere, or in Mac software you might want to use iMovie, and you can just put a photo that runs the entire length of the podcast, and you can put that online. So that's pretty easy to do as a dissemination, and it's free. So YouTube is free, so that's pretty awesome. And yeah, so I think that's basically it. I think the wrestling is actually maybe me, Kevin, sorry, because I'm using my headphones. So, but let me know if I get too animated. This is what I have to do. I have to tell my other co-hosts sometimes that if I'm interviewing them that they can't move too much. And I've just given you an example of what happens when you do. All right, Kevin, you're going to take us to the conclusions here?
Yeah, I'll take the final mile here. So essentially the basics and the conclusions and the pearls of our wisdom is that essentially we do this because, number one, we have fun. We love doing this. You know, Teresa talked a lot about us losing money. it's not about the money. It's about having fun. It's about having a single-minded purpose together where we work together to disseminate that knowledge to our group, and so that our entire MacEmerg family is connected. And so that's kind of the way to do it. And all the meetings that we've had, or we go out and talk about planning and all this stuff, it's all been about fun, and we laugh, and it's that bonding that I think that really drives our team together to create this effective podcast. And that really leads to the second part is, you have to have a good team. You have the people that you have gel with. You need to have people that have different ideas so that you can continue to work on your craft. And you need to also communicate often. This is not something that you just start and then you stop. You need to continue to communicate. We have WhatsApp groups. We email each other all the time. We work on research projects together as well. And so we really become more of like a family as well. When you have a plan, stick to it. Make sure if you have a schedule, keep on that track, because that's where your audience is going to really look out for. They're going to say, hey, this is the first of every month. I'm going to look up for this podcast, and it becomes almost like a conditioning thing. And lastly, continue to work on it. If you actually listen to our first podcast and now listen to our last one, you'll notice a significant difference, not only in the way that we interview, but the quality of the podcast, as well as the lengths and all of the aspects. So I think those kind of 4 things are the things that you need to make sure you work on and keep in mind when you work on your podcasts.
And definitely, I think we have a burgeoning community of practice here for those who are interested. Our little team is happy to pass on our wisdom and knowledge and lessons learned to others as we can demonstrate from today. But we learned it from other people. So Kevin, you have some shout outs to give.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about Anton. He was the podcast bootcamp guy. We are hoping to, I've talked to Teresa about this, to create our own McMaster internal bootcamp. So if you're interested in podcasting, I think people that have joined our talk are, keep in mind keep us in mind. We'll send out an email. We were hoping to do it actually soon, but because of COVID, obviously that's been a little bit of a challenge. But once things open up a little bit, we'll try to have that in person. I'd like to also give a little shout out to Andy Little and Drew Kauna, who are big podcasters. And I recently did a similar talk at the Cord conference before everything shut down in New York. And they're actually great mentors about how to do this kind of talk as well. If you have any questions, we have our email there, so please reach out. You can also reach us on Slack. That's why it's there. And then check out our website. Sign into our podcast like we discussed. We really want more listeners and more people to spread the word. So that's kind of our talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. Does anyone have any questions at all about, I know there's been some miscommunications back and forth throughout, but any questions about the podcast so far, or how to go about starting your own?
Yeah, you guys can go ahead and turn on your cameras and unmute. We'll stop the screen share and just have a round table discussion for a couple of minutes. All right. If you are muted, what you can do is you can press the space bar when you're on Zoom, and it opens up the audio. So that's pretty awesome. If you didn't know that, it turns your Zoom computer into a walkie-talkie basically. So it's pretty awesome.
What is the ideal length? That's great. So they did a study actually on podcast length, and this is not a medical study, just a regular bit. And they said, I think the average was 22.6 minutes. That is the ideal length that they had said.
That's very precise, yeah. We actually did a recent survey-based study to ask people what their preferences were, and 20 minutes came floating to the top there as well. We gave them a bunch of different options. That was self-report data, so not as precise as Kevin's 22.6 minutes. That being said, what we do is we aim for 20-ish minute segments. We violate that more regularly than we should, but we try to string together 3 segments then. That way people can have their commute filled with one 20-minute segment, and then when they come back in the car on the way home, they have another one. So that's kind of what we target for if we can.
And Srija, do you mean number of people for an idea podcast in when you're interviewing, or okay? So that actually depends on the type of podcast you'd like. So a couple of things. One is there are podcasts who it's just one person doing a monologue, and that actually works very effectively. I don't know if you listen to the This American Life, it's a very interview kind of documentary style, and they're actually great. If you're doing interviewing for medical podcasts, you can have one-on-one, you can have 1-on-3, 4, 5. It really just makes the editing a bit challenging, but it really depends on how and those require probably a little bit more organization in terms of scripting and the questions sent beforehand. But as the interviewer, you're going to need to actually cue a lot. And then the editing gets a little bit more challenging, but I don't think there's really an ideal. It really depends on your goal and the objective of that podcast.
Yeah, and in terms of like sustainability for your team, I think we started with a core group before, but it's grown. We have some med students that volunteer to help us with our infographics and show notes, and the website. We have more editors that have come on board as well, and we're trying to recruit some people to help with interviewing as well. So it's definitely a community sport now at this point, and I feel like it's like the AV team that you had in high school. Sometimes we have a little club and we hang out. So that's kind of what we are at this point. The next question I have is, what's the hardest thing to start? I mean, honestly, Cian, I think one of the hardest things at the beginning is just some of the tech barrier of learning all of this is pretty high. So I think that the some of our team going to the podcast camp was really, really helpful in order to start that. So I think that's what we're trying to pay it forward and have a mini version of that here locally so that we can get people started. But some of it's just, you have to learn through the school of hard knocks. So you just kind of have to log in and try and just cut some audio and do some editing. In terms of the next question, did you start your podcast internally for your program or distribute widely right from the get-go? Our intention, because we have such a distributed group of faculty actually, was to go wide to begin with. And so we did launch it onto SoundCloud directly at the beginning. It's just like no one except for our moms probably listened to it in the beginning. And then we sent it out with the listserv to the faculty, and slowly, one by one, I've been showing people, okay, so this is the podcast app on your phone. And I add it for them like on shift when I run into them. And we also ask other people to do the same. So that's been one of the ways that we've drummed up some interest and support. The emails go a long way. Let's see.
Legal measures.
Yeah.
So we talked about this actually to the podcast bootcamp. Some of the legal things that you need to talk about is, for example, you can't just use like a music from Drake. It has to be free open. For example, some information you have to, it's like kind of doing a published paper. You have to, say that this is from this person. And then other things is obviously you don't want to copyright anything. So those are kind of things. The other big aspect is patient confidentiality. So you also don't want to say something that is maybe one person in the entire country has it. You don't want to talk about that case because you know who that would be. Versus if you talk about someone with aortic dissection, then that would be fine. So those are kind of the legal measures, but that's a great question for sure.
Yeah, and I think for the other legal measures, it would be no different than if you were running a blog or a textbook or something like that online. There are kind of like canned statements that most of the universities have as a disclaimer for, this is medical information, but it's not substitute for your physician or seeing your, like, it's the same stock legal that some lawyer probably did and everyone else has copied since then. You can probably look at one of your actual like textbooks, like we have the Rosens of Emergency Medicine is a textbook. Inside they have a disclaimer. You could probably look at that as guidance. I'm sure Elsevier, which produces them, has got lots of lawyers behind making that script exactly perfect. So definitely look at that. And let's see, we have maybe time for one more question.
You have other departments.
What do we market it to? We mostly market it directly to our faculty and our residents, and that's our target market. Probably we have some listeners from outside. About 25% of our listeners are from outside, and maybe there are potential future learners, future residents, and future hires. So it's a bit of a marketing tool in that way too. So thanks so much, everyone. We can continue the conversation on Slack. I think, did someone else have a comment?
No, I just said there was just a quick comment about, do you have other departments involved? And we do try to collaborate with other specialists as well, especially our regional round collaborators.
Yeah.
If you're in medicine, there's also a really good podcast called Intern at Work by residents. That's specifically for medicine as well. So there are other departments getting involved in podcasting. So if you're really interested, give us a shout and we'll be happy to help you start your own.
Yeah, and MacEmerg is actually already three different podcasts, three different departments joining together: Peds, medicine, and family. So definitely collaboration. So.